4 centuries, the dominant explanation of the cross in Western Christianity has been rooted in retribution, Jesus taking the punishment we deserved. But is that really the whole story? And does it reflect the true heart of God? In this episode, we trace the historical development of what's often called the punishment model of the atonement. We'll explore how theology, empire, and culture combine to shape a view of God that can seem more violent than loving, and why it might be time for a different lens. This is episode 17, A Violent God? Join the conversation, share this episode with a friend, and let us know your thoughts in the comments or on social media. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps others discover this message of radical, restorative hope.
Well, welcome back to the Impact Nations podcast. This is going to be a continuation of last week's episode. So if you just happened upon this and you're just looking for a nice chat on retributive justice, this one is maybe not going to make quite as much sense without it. So make sure you go back, listen to episode 16, and then you can come back and listen to this one. But no unauthorized listening or viewing.
Because we're just carrying on.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want it to drag too long. And you can either believe that we carefully went and chose the same wardrobe, or that we got a cup of tea and we picked it up again.
Indeed. So we were where we left off was just digging into the history of how did we get here. The question I asked was, not what. Just before that quote from Stephen Morrison last week, they were trying to answer the question, why was the cross necessary? And my tongue-in-cheek question was, well, why was a new atonement theory necessary? Because, this came along sometime in the 16th century. It's like, well, was not the other one pretty good?
Yeah, it was. And we're going to answer that question. I want to just say this, and we kind of hinted at it, that the whole doctrine of PSA, which Penal Substitutionary Atonement, for obvious syllabic reasons, we'll say PSA. It began, the roots of it can be found with Augustine and original sin. Mm-hmm. So we've got the church going along for over 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. And in 1098, Bishop Anselm of Canterbury, England, he wrote a very, very famous thing called Why Did God Become Human? And its central thesis was that Jesus went to the cross as a substitution. There, we've got the word again. Mm-hmm. We said last week that we can see that in early writings. But it was because a price had to be paid to restore God's honor, that we had besmirched his honor. And this is called satisfaction theory.
Now, what was going on at the time? I've sometimes joked, again, sometimes I'm just a little too tongue-in-cheek with this stuff probably, but the penal substitutionary atonement theory, to me, often comes across as something akin to having to throw the virgin into the volcano to appease the angry God. Yeah. And I'm only being slightly tongue-in-cheek because honestly that's kind of a two-dimensional version of what it is. But my question is, like, for Anselm, what was going on in his day in the 11th century that would make him think that God needs to be appeased? How did he get there?
Everything's about worldview. Mm-hmm. Everything. For all of us at all times. We all have worldview and we don't even know it. Yep. His medieval worldview was the concept of chivalry was beginning to grow and would blossom fully by 200 years later, but it was already happening. It had to do with the way Northern Europe, including England, was set up with a feudal system where there was an overlord and then there's various layers down, but everything had to go back to give honor, prestige, importance to the feudal lord. And so honor was the most important thing. If you read, sometimes we were just talking actually a couple of days ago about Beowulf and Gawain in the Green Knight, and then later the Canterbury Tales. You'll see that the issue of a person's honor is incredibly, incredibly important in that worldview.
In that worldview, yeah.
People didn't think that was weird.
Yeah.
They didn't think anything. A goldfish doesn't think water's weird. It's just what it's in, right?
But this reminds us, and I know you're gonna show us kind of what the results of that were. But just while we're on this topic, it is so important for us to recognize two things. One, we have a worldview, like you just said. We may not be aware of it, but we have one. And so it's probably worth actually just spending time with some friends talking about, hey, what is our worldview? How do we see the world around us? And how does that affect the way we read Scripture? But then secondly, do some of the work to put yourself back in the shoes of the first century Palestinians who were writing this stuff and living this stuff, because their worldview was completely different. And so their words meant something different. If you try to take their words and put it into a different historical context, you can pretty easily lose their meaning.
You can get into trouble. And the classic example is the book of Revelation. Right?
Yes.
So this satisfaction theory, therefore, would make sense in Anselm's world, right? And because of how their whole life, they don't even know they're being taught. It's just their whole life is about honoring the feudal lord. So Anselm's satisfaction theory was completely new. It had never been written about or considered for the first 1,000 years, and it reflected the medieval social systems. But in a short time, this became the primary way that the church understood the cross. It's very interesting if you follow along. In 200 years from there, Aquinas and others, you start seeing how that was just absorbed. This whole thing of the honor of God. Now, there were some exceptions. There always are. But so we mustn't ever think uniformly. People can write on what life in the 21st century is, but it's filled with exceptions, right?
Sure.
But one that I really like was the Franciscans. I've always been, as you know, a great fan of St. Francis. And the Franciscans, they saw, just 100 years after Anselm, they saw the cross very differently. Not about honor. For them, the cross was the greatest revelation of the depth and totality of God's love for his creation. And the cross was meant to shock us and invite us back into full relationship. So love freely given. So let's back it up. I'm going to do my old teaching thing, tell you what we've learned. But we saw in the early 5th century with Augustine, we've got original sin. Actually, before that, in late 3rd century, ex nihilo begins, and then it becomes warped, as it were, or at least a different perspective, that since it was created out of nothing, therefore it's neutral, therefore the empire and the church as the chaplain of the empire can, we went over that. Then the next step was Augustine, because that led the way to original sin, depraved, we're all depraved, we're evil. We moved from Genesis 1, and God saw that it was good, to the fall. And now we come to Anselm, and he says God's honor needs to be satisfied. Of course, that's why the cross happened. And now we go to the next step, the Reformation, which is the 1500s. First half of the 1500s, you've got John Calvin, who articulated penal substitutionary atonement. He went beyond Anselm's view of God's honor needed to be satisfied, and he shifted it. He said, no, his justice needs to be satisfied. Remember we talked about a courtroom metaphor?
Yeah.
It's really important we understand the Reformers' judicial justice worldview. Just as Anselm's view of the honor of God was influenced by the world that he lived in, chivalry and so forth, by Calvin's time, Northern Europe is shifting rapidly. And it's starting to form into nations. We just think of nations now, but no, it was more language groups and culture groups. But now, as it's shifting and solidifying, it becomes very apparent that we've got to have some standardized rules. We'll call them laws, right?
Yep.
And so you've got the legal system forming, and you've got social and political structures are rapidly changing. And they needed law to reflect those changes. So there's a great emphasis on justice all of a sudden. Great emphasis. And as well, as a little aside, Calvin grew up in the home of a lawyer. His father was a lawyer, and Calvin got sent to law school to be a lawyer.
Yeah, I'm suddenly reminded of that silly metaphor. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, when you grow up in the home of a lawyer, everything looks like a courtroom drama. So when he gets to Romans 1, 2, and 3, he's like, oh, I get this. Because to be clear, like Romans talks about God as the judge. And so Calvin's like, well, I know what judges do. They mete out punishment. Because that's when you say justice too, I think we need to, again, just revisit from last week. Like the kind of justice that Calvin's growing up seeing in that during the Reformation is retributive. It's you did something
do wrong,
bad.
you get punished.
Yes.
And sometimes you get punished in a huge, huge way.
Yeah.
And not unlike today. Yeah. There was one law for the rich and another for the poor. You know.
Yeah.
So what has come to be known as PSA, I'll say it one more time, Penal Substitutionary Atonement. It's a motif. It's an idea. It's a theory that's built on the belief that Christ was punished by the Father in our place because the injustice that man introduced has to be satisfied for God to forgive our sins.
We're right back to Anselm.
That a just God can't let anything go. Nothing can go. So when Christ died in man's place, he took the punishment for our sin. And when he did, the punishment went on to Christ and therefore came off of us, and it set us free from the death verdict.
Yes.
Right?
And this is what they call imputation. Yeah.
And it was a justice system that was built upon retribution, not restoration.
Yeah.
And to the core of my being, I believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ is about the restoration of life.
Yeah.
And so we're not done yet, as hard as that was. And you know, a little thing I've said before, Calvin wrote this huge thing called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And he wrote them when he was about 10 years older than your daughter.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
He was 26 years old.
Well, everybody knows when you're in your 20s, you know everything. It's not until your 30s that you start getting dumb. But in your 20s.
You're in your 50s, you go, I'm not sure about anything anymore.
Exactly.
Well, that doesn't mean there weren't revisions and so forth, but he laid it out way back then. So what happened? Calvin's PSA model, it really kicked in the 19th century. And it had to do with a response, a reaction to the Enlightenment that said you can't know anything except by your five senses and so forth. So this whole move, Walter Wink calls it theological worldview, was on steroids in the 19th century, 1800s. It became Calvin's PSA model became rigid, and then it became more of an assumption. Everybody knows that. As soon as you hear that, your antennas should go up, right? And there were 5 principal tenets of PSA, and I'll bet you that a huge percentage of our listeners have heard these as if they are just universal truths they've always known.
Yeah.
Number one, because of original sin, there it is again, all of humanity has incurred the wrath of God. Everybody. Number two, because of his holiness, God must punish sin. He's got no option. Number three, Jesus took our punishment on himself. All this sounds very familiar, yes? Number four, on the cross, Jesus underwent and felt the full wrath of God. And number five, by deflecting God's wrath onto himself, he took it away from me.
Yeah.
Among evangelicals, this is assumed and accepted as though it has been known throughout the whole history of the church. Because it is so obviously universally accepted, there is strong opposition to anything that challenges it. And this I know.
It can be really hard, yeah. I mean, even bonkers stuff like people questioning your salvation. Like this is actually this is the bedrock of the faith, and if you don't believe this, then you must not even be saved, sort of a thing.
And then I always want to tell them about the first 1,500 years and tell them again, why does your reading begin with reform and not with the beginning, where we've got, you could fill shelves and shelves.
Sure. Well, and also I would say even, again, you said it last week, but going back to the red letters, like what did Jesus have to say? You did a series on the parables last year, I think, and we talked about this a little bit because some of the parables, when this is your worldview, some of the parables can be understood in that light, and so you helped us in some cases deconstruct that a little bit. But otherwise, when you look at Jesus' words, I even think about when he starts telling the guys what's going to happen, like, "Hey, boys, like I'm going to be arrested, get killed, raised again." Like, there's nothing about this in there. He never once indicates anything close to penal substitutionary atonement.
Not in any of the five tenets at all.
And if it was so important for us and for, again, bluntly, I'm just telling you, like salvation has been questioned. So if this is a bedrock salvation issue, why didn't Jesus teach it?
Yeah.
I don't know. And I mean, it's a convenient thing to ignore some of the things, some really, really hard things he did teach, such as, well, you didn't feed me when I was hungry. You didn't visit me when I was in prison. So I'll have no part of you, sort of a thing. Sometimes I wonder if holding on to these five tenets here is a way to not have to think about what Jesus actually said. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's not fair, but
maybe it could be. But I agree that we both had pushback. I'd like to just say that certainly in the last 20 years, I'm seeing, I think, in more and more of the church, I'm seeing some of this start to crumble, and more people are embracing, I think, a much more redemptive, restorative view, which we'll get to talk about next week, I think.
And I'm seeing that, and I'm also seeing just a general loosening of, I don't know, it's a mystery. One of the things I said it, maybe this episode, maybe last, but atonement theories. We're talking about the penal substitutionary atonement theory. You mentioned theory just a minute ago with Calvin. Next week we're going to talk Christus Victor. These are atonement theories because there is still mystery here, isn't there? Like anytime you hear somebody say, well, the Bible clearly says, I get nervous because I'm like, the Bible doesn't clearly say much of anything, actually. There's a load of paradox. There's loads of stuff going, I don't know why Paul said that. That's weird. It seems in contradiction with this. These are theories because we're trying to piece together a mystery, and it is absolutely worth pursuing that mystery. Try to piece it together, but there is mystery here.
There sure is. Well, let me look at a couple of pretty interesting PSA scriptures.
Yeah.
Romans 3:25, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God has passed over the sins that were previously committed. In the Greek, it's, as we've said before here, hilasterion.
Yeah.
And it's translated either propitiation or expiation. and the theological bias of the translator determines which English word is used. Expiation, which we don't hear as much as propitiation, is the removal of sin or guilt. It's just the process of removing it. Propitiation has to do with the appeasement of God's anger. Which means, if you go with propitiation, it means that God was angry and he had to have his mind changed by a sacrifice, a human sacrifice, because Jesus was 100% human and 100% God. The barrier that was torn open at the cross was put up by us, not by God. God in the Trinity took the initiative to break down the barrier. Yeah. Okay, that's my response to that verse.
So let me chime in here because I want to go just a little bit further. My guy's N.T. Wright. His translation of the New Testament is my go-to translation, and so you mentioned it. Whichever your translation of that Greek word hilasterion can kind of betray the bias of the translator. He's gone right back to the way the word was used in the Septuagint. Because the first time this word starts showing up is in hilasterion is in the Septuagint in Deuteronomy, which is where we get to see what is called the mercy seat, which is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, the place of atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, they would sprinkle blood for the purification of sins, for the cleansing of sins, not for the turning away of the wrath of God. And so sometimes it's just really helpful to go back to what's the first time they started using this word.
That's great.
And so N.T. Wright, I'll just very quickly read his version of Romans 3:25. God put Jesus forth as the place of mercy through faithfulness by means of his blood. He did this to demonstrate his covenant justice because of the passing over in divine forbearance of sins committed beforehand. So it is the place of mercy, and I love that. It is, again, when we look at the original context in the Septuagint, the Bible that Jesus read, the Bible that Paul read, we see it is not about the turning away of God's wrath, but rather it's about a purification. It's about a cleansing.
Beautiful. Wow, that was great. That was great. Maybe I should pull that off my shelf and it could become my go-to as well. Here's another one. Galatians 3:13. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Who pronounced the curse on Jesus on the cross? Not God, but the law. The curse of the law having become a curse for us. Next one, Isaiah 53:10. I'm going to read it from two well-known translations of the Masoretic text. ESV. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. Punishment, right? NIV. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Same concept. The first two versions depict God fulfilling his will and even finding pleasure in crushing or bruising the suffering servant. This may serve the vision of penal substitutionary atonement, but it is a galaxy away from the nature of God revealed in Jesus. So what gives? Well, what gives is the Septuagint, the version that Jesus and Paul and the apostles and the early church used for hundreds of years. And instead of it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, the Lord wishes to cleanse him of his wound. How's that for different reading? The Greek word katharesai, which we get cathartic from, New Testament uses many times in Jesus' ministry of healing. Its literal meaning is to cleanse or purify, as when Jesus cleansed the leopard. In his humanity, Christ takes on the wound of Adam, all the effects of the fall, because we certainly don't have any argument with there was a fall.
Yeah.
And the Father cleanses the human race in the body of his Son, not through punishment, but through the healing touch of divine love. So that's my response to Isaiah 53. Now, I could have gone on and on, but originally I was trying to get all this done in one episode. So we'll take that as example, and you can find some others. So for me, I want to lay out what I see the problems with PSA.
Yep.
Number one, it is built upon the assumption that justice is retributive. You know, I spent, 5 hours I've read multiple times since then, the worst prison in America. It's in Mississippi. And I had a remarkable time there. They had lifetime prisoners, lifers, that had come to Christ and were being trained to be prison chaplains. It was an amazing time with them. I was ready for them to dazzle me with whatever, their scripture, just such humility. Oh, my word. Just wonderful, open, gentle humility. But the guy who took me in had been going in quite a bit for a long time. And I said, I don't see anything here that's about getting them ready to go out. Mm-hmm. It's about restoring them. Everything is punitive, retributive. And he said, well, yeah. It hadn't occurred to him. That's what prison's for. It's to punish.
Yeah.
And I think that PSA is about the whole point of justice is to settle accounts, to pay a price. So we're back to Calvin and to some degree Anselm. But before Calvin, the church had never heard this. Secondly, and this is a really big one for me, PSA is transactional. Salvation becomes a one-time event. It's a transaction between Jesus and the Father instead of a transformational salvation that teaches and forms and moves us closer. And this is eternal life, that you might know him. Right? Mm-hmm. John 17:3. Thirdly, it projects onto God our carnal desire to keep score. Yeah. This is retributive justice. It leads to a none too subtle kind of boasting or gloating, a dualism. They're out, but we're in. Yeah. They are going to get what is coming to them. You know, that gets extended to the ridiculous, so that when there's a natural disaster, the retributive guys get on the social media saying, well, this is God's judgment for, and they pick their favorite sin, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's a projection of us onto God.
Yeah. The old adage, God made us in his image, and ever since we've been returning the favor.
Yes. Good. George Bernard Shaw. And it imagines for us, and this might be the biggest one, folks. It puts us, we're back to worldview. The water in the tank we're swimming in imagines a violent God. And that means retributive justice leads us to an unhealthy fear. Yeah. That he's the judge and we're never going to come up to his standard. Yeah. That's why I tell people all the time, he's not disappointed in you, he's not mad at you. And they can hardly hear it because they have lived in the PSA bubble for too long. It's a violent view of God who killed his own son. And why this is also very bad, it leads us into a worldview that empowers violence. Yeah. I was watching an interview with Zelensky last night, and then it was punctuated by yesterday. Yeah. And then, if I hadn't had enough, then Gaza, and the last hospital in Gaza was blown up yesterday. Yeah. So it empowers violence and fear. Well, they have it coming. They're the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
And this is how the powers rule. It's not how the triune God lives. Yeah. PSA not only gives us a violent view of God, it gives us permission to be violent. It validates retributive justice. If you look, this thought just came to me now, so I may regret it later, but if you look, well, I'll just say it. If you look at the southern states and you look at the sentences for crimes, they are so, by and large, not entirely, but as a trend, they are so much more, and of course that's the Bible Belt, that's evangelical Christianity, they are so much more punitive than in other parts of America. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. All right. So,
but I may regret saying that.
Well, we don't have a lot of time to go into it, and we've talked about it lots with Bradley before in earlier seasons. But when we read the Old Testament, there's lots of space for understanding God to be a violent and angry God.
Yeah, there is.
A lot of violent episodes done in the name of God, and at times attributed to God, or God told us to go and kill all the women and children, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, if the question is, well, how did we get here? That's got to be the starting point, is it not?
It's this retributive God, and of course, we don't have time to get into all of it again, but we can touch on it. I really believe the Old Testament is, among other things, is the narrative of Israel discovering who their God is. And especially we see it before the exile. Yeah. We see him as a tribal warrior God, and that becomes their worldview. Of course, God is angry with our enemies must be his enemies, right?
Yeah.
And so we have Billy Graham being asked to pray, and I love Billy Graham. But this is how we get caught up in this PSA. We get Billy Graham on the TV before the Gulf War to pray for God's blessing. We get praying during World War II, both sides praying for God's blessing, because obviously God's on our side.
Yeah.
Because this makes room. If he's an angry God who can pour out violence on his own son, as if we don't remember he's the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit all at once, but if he can do that, then of course there's room for us to be violent in his name, to uphold his honor, and for there to be justice.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is why this stuff is so important to talk about. This isn't just,
theology.
Geeking out on theology, and, this stuff actually really matters in the real world and can have a massive effect on on our understanding of how to treat humanity. Yeah.
So PSA places violence at the center of God's interaction with humanity in a way that cannot be reconciled with the biblical statement, God is love, 1 John 4:8. I mean, that to me, that's like right at the center of the whole thing. Yeah. You can't reconcile it. You can't get away with saying God is love, but he also, God is love, period, full stop. We've said this many times.
Yeah.
And that puts it directly in contrast with PSA and the violence that emanates from God. In that view, if he's the originator of everything, the originator gets angry at mankind and pours that anger out on his son.
Yeah.
He is not committing violence at the cross. God the Son is a willing victim of the violence that entered creation at the fall.
Yeah.
That is a massive difference.
And I think this is something I would say about Old Testament too, but it's when you're tempted to see violence being poured out from God in any biblical passage, perhaps the first question needs to be not what does this reveal about God, but what does this reveal about me? What does this reveal about humanity, about our depraved state, which is we have a tendency to want violence, to want retribution, and we're willing to paint God with that brush in order to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I want to say it one more time. This stuff's so important to me.
Yeah.
God is not committing violence at the cross. God the Son is a willing victim of the violence that entered creation at the fall.
Yeah.
The willing victim of the powers that be, the dark powers. So, the violence that we see in the crucifixion is the work of the enemy, not the Father. Outside of the church, in other cultures, in our postmodern world, people do not see themselves in terms of guilt or shame, nearly so much as within the church. They are longing for eternal purpose and connection. That's why there's a return. That's why I just read, I think it's some of Barna's stuff, saying that youngest group, I can lose track of all the names of the generations, but that 16 to 24 are in an unprecedented way for a long time. Unprecedented isn't the right word. For a long period of time, now more than ever, they are turning to the Lord. There's this sudden thing that's getting there. Why? Not like, oh, we finally realize we feel so much shame and guilt. No, they're looking for connection. Yeah. They're looking for something that is real and forever, and it is giving us eternal purpose. So PSA is not good news. It is not a beautiful gospel. Here's another problem with it. It splits the unity of the Trinity. And we said earlier in the last episode that the cry of dereliction, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? God can't separate himself from himself.
Yeah.
He is one in three persons. He was not punishing his Son. The cross is an eternal decision that was made within the Trinity. There was a decision made beyond our time and space. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go, and I'm going to suffer at the hands of the violence that came in at the fall to save.
Yeah. And when we look at Jesus' teaching, so often I'm in the Father, Father's in me, I'm in you, you're in me.
Yeah.
The problem is, if we believe that God can separate the Father can separate himself from the Son, then how much easier can he separate himself from us?
Yeah.
And
good point.
And that's just that's not very good news.
No, it's sure not.
Devastating.
Here's another reason. George MacDonald said this. PSA requires us to think of God, think of the Father of souls as if he had abdicated his fatherhood for their sins and assumed the role of the judge. Takes off his father's hat.
Yeah.
How could he?
Yeah.
How could he? Next one. This presentation of what took place at the cross has led to a distortion of the nature and purpose of salvation itself. It feeds into and encourages the hyper-individualism that has pervaded the church. Everything is about my personal salvation. Even beyond that now is about how I can have the best life, how I can. Yet at the cross, Jesus was reconciling all of mankind, and I would say all of creation, not just individuals one by one. Mm-hmm. This is for you, Tim. This is for you, Steve. No, he was reconciling everything. Salvation is much bigger than me. It is about his work in history and the world. It is about God creating for himself a people. And when I wrote that, I thought, I got to put in 1 Peter 2:9.
Of course.
But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. This highly individualized view of what took place on the cross is emphasized in PSA. It's led to a church that has largely lost sight of our corporate identity. From the beginning of hearing this too small gospel, we think that what Jesus did is about me. I lose awareness of the corporate purpose and vocation God has given to us all to demonstrate his kingdom and his mercy and his forgiveness. So to wrap this up, look at what PSA Worldview has done to the gospel. If we pray the right thing, if we say the right thing, if we do the right thing, then we will receive a good verdict in the heavenly court of law. Have you prayed the sinner's prayer? What did you pray? I want to hear. Was it right?
Yeah.
If we do it all right, then we get a good verdict at the heavenly court of law. Secondly, I think that we have projected our own love of scorekeeping, demanding retributive justice that originates in our hearts. We've put it onto our image of God. The cross shows us that it isn't that God is violent, we are. Mm-hmm. It isn't that God keeps score and demands punishment, we do. Again, the early church never heard any of this. I am not presenting a new gospel. I am presenting the ancient gospel, the gospel of 1,500 years. So, I know this means a shift, but it's a shift that I, with every fiber, would encourage people to make. You know, there aren't a lot, I'll say, it's not a hill I'll die on when we talk about various issues. Mm-hmm. This one, I'll put my flag on the hill and say, that's it.
Yeah.
I'm not moving from this.
Yeah. When I talk about these things with folks who maybe are hearing it for the first time, the conclusion that they jump to about what I'm saying, even though I haven't said it, is, oh, so you're saying there's no consequence for sin? Because for them, the only natural consequence is punishment. And so when I say God's not out to get you, God doesn't punish sin, it's something that needs to be healed. So there's no consequences for sin.
No.
What?
Sin carries its own punishment. Mm-hmm. If you touch the stove, your hand will get burned.
Yeah.
Sin is incredibly powerful. We're going to talk about Christus Victor, the victory of God at the cross over this power of sin. And sin always leads to death.
Yeah.
So it's the undoing of death, breaking the power of sin.
Yeah.
It absolutely matters, but it doesn't matter because it makes God angry. It matters because the entire cosmos works this way, which is a reflection of our loving God. Mm-hmm. So, people say to me sometimes, oh, you don't believe in hell. You bet I do. I personally don't believe in eternal torment, but I believe in hell. And to say that, I said it early on in the last episode, it really matters a lot what we think about sin, and whatever conclusion we come to, whether it's PSA or Christus Victor, it must take seriously the issue of sin and suffering. Mm-hmm. And so I said it at the beginning of this, and I'm glad you've reminded me, because there's no way in the world that what we're saying is that sin doesn't matter. It matters hugely.
Yeah. The Paul's phrase, the wages of sin is death, is 100% true. It's just that we've got it in our minds somehow over the last 500 years that God is the one paying out those wages. Like he's the one, oh, you sinned, here's your death. Have it.
Yeah.
And I just don't,
the ultimate
I don't think that's true. Yeah.
No.
What of the phrase, another classic from this camp is all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as though we don't measure up. Part of the justification theory is God has a moral standard. We are required to live up to that, which in this, taking that scripture and applying it here would be like God's moral standard is his glory. Like we've fallen short of this moral standard, God's glory, and therefore we need to be punished because we haven't met with the standard that he demanded.
Because again, we're back so much. We have so little respect for process. So little. We want a gospel that if I pray a 30-second prayer, it's done.
Yeah.
We want to be able to come forward for an altar call and a lifelong problem goes away. We want instant stuff.
Yeah.
And we talked about deification a few weeks ago, which is a way bigger theme in writing of the Eastern Fathers, certainly some of the Catholic writers, but deification is the process, the ongoing process. Sanctification is another word for it, of becoming more and more conformed into his image. Romans 8:29. And yes, this side of eternity, we've fallen short of that glory. But it's not punitive. It's, come on, keep coming.
Yeah.
It's encouragement. If we could read the New Testament as encouraging us instead of rebuking us, I think we'd be in a healthier place.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just, for fun, starting in Romans 8:28, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them, which then, of course, Paul lays out, as you just said, in verse 29. For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son, so that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And having chosen them, he called them to come to him. And having called them, he gave them right standing with himself. And having given them right standing, he gave them his glory. And so, the ultimate destination is that deification. It is his glory. Yeah. And by the way, in terms of, we're not going to get into all the election and Calvin's thoughts on that sort of thing, but I would like to point out that something you brought up a couple of weeks ago, he will draw all men to himself. And you asked the question not, well, what about so-and-so who doesn't seem to be drawn, but rather, when are they going to get drawn? When's it finally going to happen?
Does. That word means all, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that was fun. I hope that was helpful. Hey, write us. Let's, send in some buts. We'd be very happy to engage with you either in the comments or honestly, I may bring some of those into this space and we'll talk about them further because I appreciate, as I said earlier today or last week, the Bible doesn't clearly say this stuff. It requires work, and it's hard work, and there are some passages that absolutely appear to be in opposition to some of the thoughts we've expressed in the last couple of episodes. So if you're wrestling with some of those, for starters, not alone, probably I am too, let's talk about them. Write in some verses and say, but what about this one? What about that one? Or just share some comments on how this has encouraged you, if it has, or offended you. That's okay too. We just want to hear from you. We want to engage. This is a journey. This is a process. And I think this is one of the things that I'm learning to handle with better grace, with more grace. And I hope we all can be on that journey of let's not fight about it. Let's just enjoy the discovery of the person of Jesus as he is fully revealing the nature of his Father in heaven. And so let's do that with grace, shall we? We're going to be back next week to talk about another atonement theory, which is Christus Victor, and probably get a little bit of a comparison from this one to that. So
I'm even going to go back to two competing views from the early 5th century and see where either stream. We saw where Augustine led us.
Yeah.
Next week's mystery guest, we'll see where he leads us.
Boy, you're good. There is a tease right there. Tune in next week for the mystery guest. Folks, thanks so much for being with us. We don't talk about this stuff in a vacuum. At Impact Nations, we really believe this stuff, this good news that Jesus came fully revealing the Father's heart and came to conquer sin and death and to reconcile all things to God. For us, the way that looks is we go and we preach this gospel. We demonstrate this gospel to people in desperate need, people in terrible situations who are facing abuse and abandonment, are facing violence, are facing starvation. And we go with the good news that Jesus sees you, he's with you in the midst of it, and he cares enough to have sent us to bring some food or bring a place of safety, to bring words of life and encouragement, to bring a whole new way of life through skills development and job placement and internships and things like that. This stuff really, really, really matters to us. We're not talking about theory. This stuff is at the core of who we are at Impact Nations and what we do. But we can't do it without you. So thank you for giving faithfully, giving so generously. I know many, many, many of our monthly donors are listeners to this podcast. So I know I'm talking directly to you. Thank you for your faithful giving. It really helps us to just say yes when the opportunities come. Having said that, if you're listening to this and maybe you're a little bit new to the Impact Nations world, maybe you haven't yet given or haven't yet taken the plunge and started giving monthly, I would encourage you to do that. If this podcast is blessing you in any way, maybe just as a way of saying thank you to Impact Nations, just a small gift each month, it really goes a long way. It helps us to be able to know what we're going to be able to say yes to in the future. You can do that at impactnations.com. Hit that give button, and that would really, really bless us. Thank you so much. And speaking of hitting buttons, you know the deal. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell on YouTube there so you get this stuff each and every week, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so that we can be with you again next week when we talk about Christus Victor. Thanks so much. God bless you. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.